I'm so glad that we have John Turner here. I fell in love with his work on LDS history, and I've always wanted to find an occasion to bring him here to BYU. He is a professor of history and religious studies at George Mason University in Northern Virginia. He also serves as chair of the department, and he's particularly interested in American religion. He has a PhD in American history from the University of Notre Dame and a Master's of Divinity from Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary. He previously taught at the University of South Alabama. His first book was on New England religion in the colonial period of the United States, and then he turned his attention to Mormonism and also Western American history. He's probably most known, at least among many of our circles, for his biography of Brigham Young, Pioneer Prophet, which I think was able to take a lot of new and interesting information from the archives on Brigham Young and bring it to light in a public volume. And I'm confident that you'll be interested in his next book, which is coming out next year, which is a biography of Joseph Smith. Today we're going to focus on this part of the world that we're in and try to understand the ways in which settlement of the Intermountain West has come to shape where we are today. Please join me in welcoming John Turner.
Well, it's really nice to be with you. I have a strange situation at my own university this semester in which I'm teaching a really small seminar with 4 students, and which is probably because I'm an incredibly unpopular instructor. I don't know. It makes me feel badly, but here you all are. It's really nice to have you all here today. I've actually been coming to BYU with some regularity since around 2008. I spent a few summer months here doing research for Pioneer Prophet. My family has spent some time out here the last few summers while I've been learning about Joseph Smith. Over the years, I've had a number of chances to visit BYU classrooms and chat with students here. Generally, I will just say I've invariably found the students well-informed and curious. I'm following the general advice that one should sort of flatter the audience, but in this case, only with things that are true. So Quinn mentioned the election. I was thinking about elections in early Utah. This is tangential to today's subject, but this is a page of election returns from the Utah Territory in 1851. And it got me thinking, you know, what's different now versus then? Back in the earlier years of the Territory, they used numbered ballots for elections that were linked to the name of the voter. So you didn't have to have any concerns about electoral fraud because you could see, you know, all the people who had voted, and if they were wrong, I guess they could have piped up or you could have done something about it. In this case, I love the fact that the person recording the returns was church clerk Thomas Bullock, and he put his name first on the list. The other thing that was really nice about early Utah elections, there's no reason to be stressed in advance of them because they were nearly unanimous. As Brigham Young said, you know, the people know well enough to be counseled in how they should vote. So you didn't have to have any anxiety before an election because you could be absolutely assured of what the outcome would be. And it would be almost, there was no polarization either. You know, none of this 50-50 stuff that gets everybody so worked up. So I don't know. Eventually, the Utah Territory moved away from that system I think in 1878, the territory amended its constitution and adopted the secret ballot. I guess there could be some things in favor of that, but maybe we should just go back to 1850s Utah for an election and try that instead. What I'm going to do this afternoon is sketch what I think are two significant moments in Brigham Young's policies toward Native peoples, one in 1850, one in the mid-1860s, and then draw some conclusions about Young's ideas and actions and about the broader ramifications of Latter-day Saint settlement. And I'm not sure, by the way, I don't know if folks here still like Brigham Young. I was shocked this morning. I was visiting with a friend in the administration building, and I came outside and I saw they had the statue all saran wrapped or something like that. And I thought, my goodness, do they not like this guy anymore? And then I saw the other statues on campus were also saran wrapped, so I guess it wasn't particular to Brigham. I should warn you that the setup of the argument is a bit of a dodge. I'm making Brigham Young my main focus because I know more about him than about any related subject today. But I don't think that Young's personality or decisions were decisive for the legacy of colonialism and settlement and conquest in Utah. Also, one other note, I'm using the term settler in its straightforward, morally neutral sense, not with the loaded meaning assigned to it by theorists of settler colonialism. Okay. Mount Timpanogos was beautiful this morning. It's really nice to come here from Northern Virginia this time of year. Brigham Young purposefully avoided settlement in Utah Valley upon his initial arrival in the Great Basin because of the presence of various bands of Utes, known as Timpanogos Utes or fish eaters. The streams that flowed into Utah Lake were bountiful sources of fish and sustenance. In 1848, however, a few Mormon settlers moved into the valley. They interfered with the Utes' traditional means of subsistence. In return, natives stole Mormon livestock and horses, which they sometimes drove up into the canyons. Settlers called for violent reprisals against the Indians. And the question of how to proceed came to Brigham Young, who responded in what became a very customary pattern. He reminded the saints that the Utes were among the children of Abraham, the descendants of Israel, the remnants of Israel. He also told them that they shouldn't apply, they shouldn't apply white standards of morality to cases of Indian theft. But by March 1849, he changed his mind amid continued cases of theft and skirmishes. Young authorized an expedition that tracked a group of alleged Ute thieves. The expedition killed all of them except one 16-year-old boy. That month, church leaders authorized the creation of a Utah Valley colony, initially called Fort Utah, later known as Provo. Around 150 settlers planted the colony. What about the Timpanogos Utes, who were still here? Church leaders intended to preserve their morals, make fishers of them, and then the saints can buy the fish of them for a trifle, which will preserve their good feelings. Of course, it didn't work out that way. 3 settlers killed an Indian man who refused to surrender a shirt the settlers claimed had been stolen. According to a somewhat later account, they shot him, cut open his abdomen, filled it with rocks, and sunk the corpse in the Provo River. Utes then increased their attacks. In January 1850, settlers wrote Young and asked for his counsel. They hoped that he would authorize an attack. Not so fast. The Indians, these are Young's words, are wild, uneducated, naked, destitute, and they mostly steal from necessity and think it no harm. He even called out the settlers for their racism. They wouldn't shoot a white man who stole a shirt. Young again soon changed his mind. Isaac Higbee, representing the Fort Utah settlers, met with Young on January 31st, 1850. He told the church president that the settlers were unanimous. They wanted a military reprisal. Higbee goaded Young by saying that the Utes thought he was weak. They say the Mormons have no captain. Young changed course again. I say, go and kill them. There was a U.S. Army surveying expedition in the Salt Lake Valley at the time, led by Captain Howard Stansbury and Lieutenant John Gunnison. Young visited Stansbury's lodgings and asked the men for their advice. A church clerk reported that they were decidedly of opinion that this is a case of necessity and we ought to use up the marauders forthwith. They applauded Young's decision and offered to provide guns or any other supplies. Young appointed future apostle Daniel H. Wells to lead a militia expedition against the Utes. And Young made it clear that Ute men would receive no quarter from his troops. We shall have no peace until the men are killed off, though he intended to let the women and children live if they behave themselves. And Young knew that his people, at least some of his people, might have some religious scruples against killing Indians. Joseph prophesied, Young stated, many of the Lamanites will have to be slain, many of them by us, providing sanction from the church's founding prophet for this mission. Daniel Wells carried out Young's wishes. His men tracked a group of Utes from Rock Canyon, not far from here, to Table Point near the southern end of Utah Lake. According to John Gunnison, the Mormons persuaded the Utes to surrender by promising peace to them. The Utes surrendered their arms. We shall deal with them in the most summary manner, as soon as another day favors us with its light, Wells informed Young. And he asked the church president for advice about what they should do with the women and children. Young's response was a bit oblique, but I think nevertheless clear. You will not suffer Indians who are known to be hostile and have come in your possession because they were sick and could not fight to want for anything. Neither suffer them to go free until they are cured. Your surgeon, Mr. Blake, is no doubt well provided with medicine and will be ready to prescribe that which will effect that most desirable of all objects, perfect health. Young recommended that little children be taken captive to be trained as servants. Peaceful women and older children could be freed. But for adult men, let it be peace with them or extermination. The operation was over, it turned out, by the time Young's response reached Utah Valley. The Indian captives did indeed receive a perfect cure for their sickness. They were shot. Perhaps some had tried to escape, but mostly they were cut down in cold blood. Wells informed Young as much. U.S. Army Surgeon James Blake, the Mr. Blake referenced in Young's letter, had the corpses decapitated in order to send the heads to Washington for medical research. Altogether, Latter-day Saint militiamen killed several dozen natives in this Utah Valley operation. The February 1850 campaign accomplished the Mormon conquest of Utah Valley. Settlers soon established the beginnings of 8 Utah Valley towns. For natives, the consequences were devastating. The depletion of Utah Valley fisheries, disease, impoverishment. The Saints also disrupted the Ute slave trade, which took away another source of subsistence. Later in the year, Young lamented the state of the native peoples in what was now the newly created Utah Territory. Naked Indians, the church president wrote, were worse by far than wild beasts. He recommended that the government place the Indians on reservations, such as in the eastern slope of the Sierra Nevada. Let the Indians be removed. We can then devote more time to agriculture, raise more grain to feed the starving millions desirous of coming hither. The idea of Indian removal to reservations was common in the United States at the time. U.S. Indian Commissioner Luke Lea that same year called for the forcible removal of each tribe to a country adapted for agriculture. It would be years before the creation of a Ute reservation, but it was easy by this point to foresee a very restricted future for Utah natives. Brigham Young did have other things on his mind besides conquest and removal. In May of 1850, the church president went to Utah Valley and met with a group of around 20 Ute leaders. As at many other such meetings in the American West, there was discussion of land and trade, but this meeting was a bit different. The saints in attendance sang 2 hymns, Young preached a sermon, and then he spoke in tongues. Back in 1832, Brigham Young had been convinced to be baptized, in large part because he understood the power of God when he observed a group of Pennsylvania elders speak in tongues. He then experienced this spiritual gift himself and spoke in tongues in front of Joseph Smith in Kirtland. On at least one occasion, Young even sang in tongues in the Kirtland Temple. Speaking in tongues was a common practice among the early Latter-day Saints. Records suggest that Brigham Young himself rarely engaged in this practice after he left Nauvoo, but he did so on this particular occasion. It suggests to me that he felt an unusually strong presence of the divine at this Utah Valley meeting. When Joseph Smith ordained Brigham Young as an apostle in 1835, Smith had a vision that Brigham Young would speak to hostile Indians in the Southwest in their own tongue. The records don't give us an answer, but I wonder whether Young believed that Smith's prophecy was now being fulfilled. The month after this meeting, 126 Indians were baptized into the church. One of those baptized that year was Walkara, who had uneasy relations with the saints until the end of his life in 1855. So just quickly, let's step back and review what we might conclude about this episode in early Utah history. First, I'd say Brigham Young, did not come to the Great Basin with the intention of killing natives. In fact, his first instinct was to restrain his people when conflict arose. But as relations deteriorated, after some vacillation, Young unleashed a brutal campaign of violence. Second thought, the saints and officials and officers, so the saints on the one hand and officials and officers of the United States, were often at odds during these years on many issues, but not on this question for the most part. Stansbury and Gunnison backed Young's decision to fight. The United States Indian Commissioner and Brigham Young had very similar ideas about what would be best for the Indians and white settlers, Indian removal to reservations. And also, Brigham Young did not feel that his Indian policy contradicted church teachings. He did view the Utes as among the descendants of Israel. He did feel the power of God course through his body as he met Ute leaders. Whether we're talking about 17th century New Englanders or mid-19th century Latter-day Saints, I think it's easy to slide into the easy way out of thinking about white brutality toward Indians as a result of either religious hypocrisy or apostasy or something like that. We might think that no true Christian, no true Latter-day Saint would be okay with the slaughter and decapitation of prisoners. The fact is, they often were, and Brigham Young was in this instance. In 1852, when President Millard Fillmore appointed Young as Utah's first territorial governor, he also became the territory's ex officio superintendent of Indian affairs. Young explained that his uniform policy was that it is better and cheaper to feed and clothe the Indians than to fight them. This idea was also not original to Brigham Young. The previous year, a group of Indian commissioners in California observed that it's cheaper to feed the whole flock for a year than to fight them for a week. But Young made cheaper to feed them than fight them his maxim. He would constantly remind Utah settlers of this fact. But as the conquest of Utah Valley makes clear, what Young did was fight first, then feed. Young's overriding goal was to establish a kingdom in the Great Basin that could not be dislodged, and he pursued whatever Indian policy was most conducive to that goal. Okay, that was my first episode, so we can do one more. Quinn said, I only have you until 2:15, so I'm going to have to speed up a little bit. I'm kidding, don't worry. But let's fast forward to the mid-1860s. Brigham Young is no longer governor or superintendent of Indian affairs in the Utah Territory. There are some new forces in town. For instance, in 1863, Colonel Patrick Edward Connor, stationed in Salt Lake City during the Civil War, marched on a Shoshone village on Bear River. Connor's men took no male prisoners and killed around 235 men, women, and children. The massacre earned Connor the rank of brigadier general and the nickname of the Exterminator, which is what at least some Westerners wanted for natives. 2 years later, tensions grew between Utes in central Utah and Mormon settlers. A Ute chief named Antonga, or Black Hawk, and his band of warriors drove off a cattle herd near Manti and then killed 2 Mormon militiamen who were in pursuit. The raid wasn't impromptu. It came after an altercation between a Manti settler and a minor Ute leader, but the real causes were long-term. Mormon encroachment on Ute land, dwindling resources, poverty. Black Hawk gained influence in the coming months, and sort of like back in 1849, 1850, there was a cycle of reprisals. Mormon livestock captured, the murder of non-combatants on both sides. The Nauvoo Legion tried but couldn't track Black Hawk's band. And the dynamics from the 1850 conquest of Utah Valley repeated themselves. Mormon settlers urged Brigham Young to launch what could have become a war of extermination. Young rejected the idea. We have no desire to inflict indiscriminate punishment upon both the innocent and the guilty, he stated. In June 1865, Young went to Spanish Fork for a council with Ute chiefs. That's Young from 1 year beforehand, looking very dapper in my opinion. At the time, the U.S. government was offering the Utes 60 years of annuities in return for their removal to a reservation in the Uinta Mountains. Young urged them to take the deal. He told them it was the best deal they were going to get, and take it or leave it, settlements would expand. We shall occupy this valley and the next, he warned, and the next, and so on, until we occupy the whole of them. All but one of the chiefs who were present signed. The holdout was a man named Sandpitch, who was the father of Black Hawk. Sandpitch signed the agreement 1 week later. Raids and murders continued despite this agreement. And when they did, Young embraced harsher tactics. Whoever is not with us is against us, you might say. Young demanded that ostensibly friendly Utes actively side with his people against Black Hawk. He authorized the arrest of Sandpitch and a number of other Utes. Mormon leaders threatened to shoot the prisoners if hostilities continued. Acting on intelligence from Sandpitch, Utah militiamen captured and executed several raiders near Manti. Then the militia murdered a woman and boy who participated in a failed attempt to free Sandpitch from captivity. The Ute prisoners then managed to escape subsequently, but the militia wounded Sandpitch during the escape, then tracked him down and killed him. Violence then spiraled out of control. In Circleville, Utah, settlers arrested 20 Indians whom they suspected of collaborating with Black Hawk. They executed everyone save 4 young children. When Young learned about it, he condemned the executions, but he did not urge the punishment of those responsible. And these actions were, at least to a large extent, the inevitable result of his recent harder-edged policy. In fact, at the time he was warning Ute leaders that the church would have to cut them all off if they didn't help the saints locate Black Hawk's band. Then, there's a lot of tacking here, but then in the summer of 1866, Young tacked in the other direction. A Springville man named James Ivy killed a Ute whom he blamed for his father's death. Young insisted that Ivy was as much guilty of murder as if he had stepped up and killed a white man. A jury acquitted Ivy, evidence actually that Young's will didn't always prevail in the territory. Then in July 1866, just a few months after he was talking about having to cut off or kill all of the Utes, Young came to Springville and delivered what I think is a somewhat remarkable address. He was still upset over Ivy's crime. He warned settlers that if they did such things, they would have to pay for it with their own blood or risk their eternal salvation. Those who feel as if they should wipe out the Lamanites needed to repent. Young even allowed that he sometimes felt that way himself. But if he ordered the wholesale slaughter of the Indians, he would bring a curse upon his own people. It was time to welcome the Indians back to their homes, Young said. They buried their fathers and mothers here, and children, and this is their home. Young recognized that Mormon settlement had been devastating for the Utes. When we came in, there were great hordes of fish in this lake, in abundance, and they came here to catch the fish. Young contended that the saints had a duty to feed the Indians because we are living in their possessions and in their homes. It occurs to me, Brigham Young could write a land acknowledgement for a modern university. That's pretty good. At the same time, Young didn't, I thought that was a funny aside, by the way. None of you laughed. I know some of this is grim, but at the same time, Young didn't apologize for Mormon settlement. He insisted that the saints weren't interlopers. God had brought them to the Great Basin. Both peoples now shared the land, and the saints had to provide for natives whose sustenance they had imperiled. He wasn't offering the natives justice. He was offering them some measure of subsistence in exchange for peace. The residents of Springville probably would have preferred a bellicose war sermon. Not all that many political leaders in the American West would have called for restraint and coexistence under these circumstances. Young didn't know it, but Black Hawk had been wounded the previous month. He never fully recovered and died several years later. Black Hawk agreed to stop fighting the next year. Sporadic raids by other groups of Utes continued into the 1870s. When he first came to the Great Basin, Brigham Young had imagined a much different future for the region's native peoples. Joseph committed to me the keys to open the gospel to every Lamanite nation, he had stated. That optimistic vision of Lamanite redemption partly went by the wayside amid conflicts over land and resources, and I think also because of the cultural gap between Latter-day Saints and Utah natives. Young came to a much more modest prediction that a tiny remnant of Israel would embrace the gospel. A portion of Utah's surviving native peoples did indeed convert, often combining Latter-day Saint teachings with native practices and beliefs. For the vast majority of natives, whether Paiute, Ute, or Shoshone, Mormon colonization of the Great Basin under Brigham Young's leadership unleashed devastating consequences. There were an estimated 12,000 or more natives living in the future Utah Territory when Young and the pioneers arrived in 1847. There were less than 3,000 in 1900. By that point, the white population of the territory was nearly 300,000. Young was prophetic, perhaps, when he suggested that the Indian would dwindle away, but a remnant would be saved. One closing thought. I've made Brigham Young my focus, but that outcome of devastating consequences didn't really hinge on the person of Brigham Young or on the particularities of Latter-day Saint settlement. In broad strokes, this history resembles that of other places in the American West, indeed in the history of what became the United States more generally. It's likely that had a different man served as church president during these years, the outcome would have been very similar. And I think you can perhaps get a sense of that from Young's own vacillations and indecision about how to respond to conflict between Mormon settlers and Native peoples in the territory. And that's a thread between the two episodes I've talked about this afternoon. Young wanted for natives to remain at peace as white settlers moved onto their land and took their resources. That wasn't possible, and so Young vacillated when tensions mounted and violence erupted. Settlers wanted military action against recalcitrant natives. Young would often demur and urge peace, but eventually he authorized killing. Then afterwards, he would regret the killing and urge peace once again. He fought them, then he fed them. So I would love questions from you on anything I've talked about. Anything else about Brigham Young also, if you'd prefer to talk about other things. And if you have objections, counter contentions, or other thoughts, any sort of dialogue is totally welcome. So.
Thank you very much, Professor Turner. We do have about 20 minutes to open this up for conversation and discussion. If you have a question, we just invite you to raise your hand. We've got two folks on each side of the room that will bring you a microphone. We invite you to stand, tell us your name. If you're faculty, tell us what you do. If you're a student, also please tell us what you study. And we'll get through as many questions as we can. If you do need to leave for class at 1 p.m., you're also welcome to leave when you need to do that. Thank you.
Yes, please. I guess they're going to bring you the microphone.
Hello, my name is Elijah. Deciding what I'm studying, so I still don't know. But question with regards to kind of the seeming hyperreactivity of the Latter-day Saints with regards to kind of deteriorating relations with the natives. Do you believe part of that was a consequence of kind of previous kind of persecution and poor relations with other groups within the United States? Do you think that kind of carried over into the way they interacted with the natives? It kind of maybe had a sort of a complex with regards to prior persecution?
That is a great question, Elijah, and you don't need to feel at all badly about still making up your mind about what to study. I've just talked about how indecisive Brigham Young could be. So you can also be indecisive at his university. I think that's totally fine. Were Mormon settlers sort of hyper-reactive or overreactive because of persecutions they had experienced in the eastern United States? I don't know. But I think I would say I don't think that actually in this case was a major factor, because Latter-day Saint settlers, when it came to tensions with natives and decisions to employ violence, responded similarly to non-Latter-day Saint settlers in the American West. So I'd say probably not. Now, I would say the Latter-day Saints definitely responded in particular ways to officers and office holders of the United States who came to the Utah Territory. And in that case, prior experiences in Missouri and Nauvoo definitely shaped the way they responded, including the way that Brigham Young responded, who I think was absolutely traumatized by what had transpired in Nauvoo in ways that fundamentally changed his approach to leadership during the last several decades of his life. So, great question. Look, the mic's right there. That was convenient.
I know, it was too close. Hi, my name is Ann Rasband. I'm a political science and women's studies student here at BYU. So I was wondering, like, I can't imagine that there wasn't some division among, like, the general population of the Saints about how this issue should be handled, and there was some belief that there should be, like, peaceful relations rather than just execution. And so, like, if that's the case, like, what did those demographics look like? Like, what was that kind of division looking like? And, like, I know there were differences between, like, American settlers versus, like, the European immigrant settlers, and, like, what did those demographics look like that was determining, like, who was supportive of the Native Americans and who was antagonistic?
So that's a great question. It's a very political science-y question. It's as if maybe BYU political science department had surveys of public opinion back in the 1850s. Wouldn't that be nice on all sorts of subjects? I don't know. I think what occurs to me is, and I think this is true, I'm going to just broadly speak about U.S. history. For the most part, I also spent some time examining the history of Plymouth Colony in the 1600s, especially vis-a-vis natives. And when tensions arose, what was most typical, and this is really because they were the ones whose writings survived, there would be a minister or two who would complain about the colony's harsh treatment of natives. And those opinions stand out because they're relatively rare, especially for people who are living in active fear of violence. I think, also to speak broadly about the United States in the 19th century, think about the most fervent opponents of Andrew Jackson's policy of Indian removal. Those were individuals in New England, far removed from the scene. You could find opponents elsewhere as well, but they were generally the minority. So I don't think there were big divisions among Latter-day Saint settlers about what to do, especially in these particular moments of tension. I would also say it's really easy. Things are reasonably peaceful in Utah Valley in 2024. So it's really easy to react by either not comprehending or judging the fearful ways in which people responded. And I'm a little uncomfortable with that, which wasn't your question, but I'm just opining. So. I think you're going to be next, Reed.
Hi, John. Thanks. I'm Philip Barlow from the Neil A. Maxwell Institute here at BYU. You've stressed in a patterned way in your responses to us and in your initial comments that in broad strokes, as you put it, there wasn't so much distinction here in the Latter-day Saint interactions with the Native Americans, but I'm wondering if you could zoom the camera in a little bit and talk in less broad brushstrokes, because the Saints obviously had a different lens through which they imagined the Lamanites at that point in Mormon history, as it was called. They identified these as a fallen, chosen people with a complex history delineated in the Book of Mormon. You're not suggesting that the broad strokes are so common with this group and the rest of the nation that made no difference, or are you?
So it's a great question. So I would say yes and no. So one of the other things that Brigham Young was persistently interested in was the rescue / capture / adoption of Native children and sometimes women by Mormon households, and that would be a means for Lamanite redemption. One of the other things that he was interested in, and possibly this dates back to Joseph Smith as well, was the idea of marriage between Latter-day Saint men and Native women in particular. So those things were also important to him in a way that might not have been to many other Americans in the 19th century. But then it does occur to me that there's still a lot of commonality here as well. In general, a lot of white Americans were interested in the idea of civilizing and redeeming Native children, either through adoption or education or some combination thereof. And, again, stretching back to 17th century New England, that was also understood as a prime way of Christianizing Native peoples. So yes, I think the particular theology here is noteworthy and original, but I think in terms of shaping policy and decisions, maybe not so much. Reed, I think you had a question.
Hi, Reed Nielsen from the administration. I just finished a biography of Kit Carson and the settlement of the Southwest, which was a very different experience there with the Navajo and some of the others. One thing that I was curious and struck by as I read this was the amount of corruption on the part of the Indian agents in terms of food and materials and all sorts of things, and how that kind of was sent from the east and it watered down and everyone kind of took what they wanted. How long was Brigham Young Indian agent or superintendent of Indian Affairs, and what was not his policy in terms of violence and that, but how did he administer? Was it similar or different from what happened in like the Southwest or other parts of North America?
That's a great question. So he was superintendent of Indian Affairs in the Utah Territory officially for 7 years. Until he was replaced as governor during what became known as the Utah War in 1857. The first thing that comes to mind is, and this was very common for Indian agents more generally, is a persistent attempt to get the U.S. government to pay his bills. He would expend resources managing Indian affairs or maybe feeding natives, and then hope that Uncle Sam would foot the bill. Were all of his claims above board? I have no idea. I don't know. I bet most agents did a little bit of padding. I don't know if that was the case in this instance either. I don't think there was rampant corruption. And Uncle Sam was not very good at honoring those claims in an expeditious way anyway. So no matter what, he didn't squeeze much money out of the U.S. government during those years. Yes.
My name is, Bruce, and I'm an international relations major. And I'm wondering about those Native Americans who joined the church, were baptized. You said like 100. I don't even know how many there were, or what that looked like. Did they have bishops? Did they have, and what became of them? And
Yeah.
Speak to that.
That's a great question, Bruce. Well, honestly, the first thing I'll say is it's something I probably need to spend more time researching, because I really didn't do that when I worked on this book. One just methodological principle that I use for that discussion, which I think applies to a variety of Christian missions throughout U.S. history, is in an instance like that, it's totally fine to say, I probably, this is what I said, maybe 120 Native individuals were baptized. I wouldn't use the term conversion to describe that. I prefer to use the term affiliation or alignment. And you can see this, again, also, there's good parallels with 17th century New England history. Large numbers of Native peoples aligned themselves with Christianity in the second half of the 17th century, many of whom, over time, had genuine spiritual experiences and acceptance of their new tradition. In this case, especially for the 1850s, information is very scattered. Wakara, for instance, sort of went back and forth on how much he wanted to be aligned with the church or with the saints. I will say that, again, in very broad strokes, as opposed to the small number of African American members of the church, natives who were baptized did have at least some access to the church's most sacred ordinances. I wouldn't say they were, equal status or access to everything within the church, but it's an interesting, I think, contrast. So, good question. Yes.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Morgan. I'm an econ major. First, just thank you for coming. And I don't know, I love hearing about church history, but I also appreciate hearing it from like more external perspectives than traditionally what I get in my own circles. But I just had a question.
Happy to help.
Yeah. Like with a lot of these lectures that we've done, like legacies of colonialism, we ask questions about, what are the lasting impacts today? And then also too, like, thoughts on like kind of corrective actions if necessary and where to be taken. If you have any like comments on just kind of like, modern responsibilities and like, where efforts can be put in the case of like remediating certain like wounds that may be lingering. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that with regards to this material. I'd appreciate it.
I'll give you the 2-minute thought. Wise words of wisdom from an external source, and then I think we have to close. So I've thought about a fair bit about the legacy of colonialism during my career as a historian, from early New England to Utah, to the way that some scholars understand modern-day Israel through the lens of settler colonialism. In particular, I haven't resolved how I should feel about the legacy of colonialism in either early New England or early Utah. The discipline of history, is it really about how we should feel about historical developments or what we should do in the present? But I do think that affects how scholars write about the past. Do they celebrate? Do they lament? I don't subscribe to the ideology of settler colonialism in the sense of making colonialism a almost perpetual structure rather than an event or series of events. I think that ideology elides change over time, which is what historians prize in their analysis, and it sorts diverse peoples into baskets of oppressed and oppressors far too bluntly. At the same time, Brigham Young wasn't correct when he insisted that his people weren't interlopers. Obviously, from the perspective of Native peoples in Utah, they were. Nevertheless, I do appreciate, and I love to end with them, I appreciate the sentiments in Brigham Young's Springville address that I quoted from. He knew that Mormon settlement had created circumstances in which some people suffered greatly, while other people had greater chances to flourish. And at least at that moment, he found a way to hold those two things together, which I think is at least not a bad starting point for us when examining the early history of the Utah Territory. So thank you all for coming and questioning and listening.